Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your hosts for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Ken Ross. Ken Ross, son of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, is the president and founder of the EKR Foundation and is a former board member of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Center. His responsibilities include handling over 80 publishers of Dr. Ross's work in 41 languages, public relations, copyright and trademark issues, website maintenance, developing foreign Kubler-Ross chapters, developing strategic partners, and preserving her archives. While growing up, Ken traveled with his mother extensively while she was on her numerous foreign trips. He witnessed her lectures and workshops, consultations with dying patients. Ken was the principal care provider for his mother in the last 9 years of her life until her passing in 2004. Ken has lectured on his mother's legacy for hospices in various conferences in South America, Asia, and Europe, and is consulting on a motion picture, a television series, and multiple documentaries, both foreign and domestic, honoring his mother's life and work. Ken, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here, and nice to see you again, Fran. It's been a while.
It has, so we're so excited. So Ken, before we get into your work with the foundation, I'd like to ask you, what was your experience with your grief when your mother died?
Well, as you can imagine, my mom talked about it a lot, ad nauseum for decades and decades, and she always tried to prepare us, not only for her death, but for my father's impending death, and for all death and loss. And so I think my grief was really not so much about her death, but about her strokes and being incapacitated and being paralyzed. I think my grief was more for her loss in that fashion versus when she died. I knew she was at peace, but the last 9 years of her life were pretty challenging. So I think my grief was really more towards her challenges of the last 9 years and not so much of her actual death. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. She was so much a life force in your life. Seeing her frail must have been very, very difficult and challenging in caring for her.
Right. And she was, incredible overachiever. I mean, she was nonstop, for decades and decades, constantly going. So for her to be forced to sit still and not be able to cook and garden and go shopping by herself, and her lack of independence was really very tough for her. It was much tougher than dying was easy, she said. But sitting here in a chair like a zombie, that's the tough part. So it was the loss of ability and, going out and participating and being able to contribute to society, which really was the hard part for her.
Yeah, well, God bless her for having such a wonderful son who cared for her so well in her end-of-life years. So let's talk about what it was like being Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's son and your witness to all of the brilliant work she did.
Well, how many hours do we have? So, my mom's first book came out when I was 9 years old. And so from that point on, her calendar got bigger and bigger, and it went out for 3 years at one point. So the only way to really spend quality time with mom was to travel with her. And I love to travel, and we had done it when I was much younger, so it just seemed like a normal thing to do. So basically, I just say, okay, for spring break, I'd like to join you here. For Christmas here. For summer, I'd like to go to South America, and then Egypt for New Year's. And, it was like a big game. So I was doing 3 or 4 trips a year all over the globe following her, and she would give a few lectures, do some workshops. And then we'd go out and have fun and be crazy. So it was really an amazing experience. So what I didn't have as far as quantity, I had certainly made up for it in quality. So that was really fantastic. Just watching her speak to, thousands of people every night in every, country around the planet. It was just crazy.
So tell us a little more. Did her research was on the 5 stages of grief for those who were dying. And was that more what took her career off as a lecturer and a traveler, or was there some front end that we don't know about?
Well, she started investigating death and dying back around 1965. And so when the book came out in 69, she said it wasn't just about death and the 5 stages, it was about unconditional love and about giving patients a voice and being able to express themselves as human beings, not as a number in a bed or a case number, or, this is this kind of cancer patient, that kind of cancer patient. She wanted everyone to have a voice. And that's what really made her angry, that people weren't treated as individuals and treated with compassion and love. So she said it wasn't even about the 5 stages. It was just about dealing with grief in an intelligent manner and not hiding from death, which is what people did back in the 60s and 70s. No one was talking about it.
Yeah. And she started a dialogue around something that people just were not talking about. I know that you could probably attend any training that anyone's doing anywhere on grief or bereavement, and talking about the pioneers who first started speaking about this and blazing a trail. And your mother is right at the top of the list of those who really set that standard. And I'm glad to hear you even say about that her book was about so much more than that. I know her other works following that really emphasized who she was and what she cared about and what was important, certainly to her.
Right. If you can imagine, she began her work basically when she was 40. Her first book came out, and then she retired in her 60s. And in that time, she did roughly 24 books, wrote hundreds of chapters. She did AIDS projects, started the hospice movement, palliative care movement. She was giving workshops around the world, starting the first hospice in a jail, trying to start the first hospice for AIDS babies. She had a working farm. She was a doctor. She saw patients. This woman was nonstop for like 25 years. So people say, Ken, I don't have time to do that. I'm like, no, there's no such thing. If Elizabeth can do that in 25 years, you can do anything on the planet. It's up to you to manage your time and just go out and go for it.
Remarkable. So when you and I met, I want to say, oh my goodness, 5 years ago, maybe even 6 years ago, I'll never forget something that you shared with me. And that was that the stages of grief were research done on those that were dying. And correct me if I'm wrong in my memory, but I believe you added to that, it was never meant for those that were living. Can you bring clarity on that?
Again, that would take several hours to bring clarity, but I just happen to have the book here, and I don't know if you can see this well on the screen, but if you look at this chart, which is, in a real copy of On Death and Dying, I'm not making this up, you see that there's more than 5 stages, right? I mean, there's clearly 10 stages here. And Elisabeth said, it's very ironic because people tell me, grief is complicated, so there can't be 5 stages. And Elisabeth said, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's the whole point of talking about the 5 stages, is that grief is complex and made up of different components. She goes, that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying you have to pick 5. 5 is like the shorthand. She talked about anticipatory grief, partial denial. She talked about hope, shock, anxiety, dreams. All these are part of the stages or phases. She said, these are 5 of the principal ones I am seeing. But the point is that grief is made up of different components, and no one was really saying that in the late 60s.
Yeah.
So she said, yeah, grief is complex. If you want to say there's 10 stages or 20, it doesn't matter. What I'm saying is grief is made up of different components, and we should be aware of that. So, don't worry about the 5 stages as being, this little ladder you need to climb to graduate grief. So the whole point is that, we have to deal with grief and all different models and phases and whatever words you want to use. People get hung up on that, but the point is grief is complex and everyone's grief is unique, but there are some commonalities, and that's what she was trying to demonstrate with On Death and Dying.
Right. And it was done for those that were dying, correct?
Initially, she thought it was just for the dying, but very rapidly she saw that the families were going through it and the nurses. And so even in her second book, which came out, I think, in 1974, she said, please be aware that, these stages apply to people who go blind, to the staff, to the families. So initially, I think she did think it was only for the dying, but then she realized very quickly within 2 years, I have documents showing that she was saying that applied to other people as well, as far as loss. And maybe the stages apply differently, but again, it's a defense mechanism geared towards people who are experiencing change, loss, grief, etc.
You said something just a few minutes ago that I think is certainly significant, and it's the whole idea behind that there are these things that people go through is that there are commonalities about what people experience, and actually that being true is the reason why we have peer support, and people can get together in groups and meet people who have had losses and relate to one another, because though grief is personal and is unique and there are different ways we go through it, there are those commonalities that help to validate the experience of grief and what that is in our lives. And I've always looked at least the first time I read On Death and Dying, it validated for me what I was seeing in the patients at the hospice where I worked, what I was seeing in families, and what I experienced in my own life going through loss. And so to me, there's something about that connectedness and something around this idea of validating our experiences as humans in this.
And another important point I'd like to make about this book is that the central theme of the book is that Elisabeth is trying to reverse the dehumanization of the dying process, which was happening because everyone was replacing compassion with technology. And she thought this is a huge mistake. I mean, we've got to treat everyone as an individual with love and compassion and listen to what they say. When they're ready to listen, when they're ready to speak, we've got to be ready to listen. It's not based on our needs, our beliefs, but the patient is our teacher. And so that's what she was trying to make clear with this book.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not treating grief. We're
treating symptoms and diseases.
Yeah.
But we're not treating the person.
But we're in a journey with the person and learning from them. Right.
Right. And unfortunately, in American medical schools, they were trying to dehumanize it. Just treat the symptoms, treat the disease. But no, you got to treat the person as a human being. And that's what she was really fighting for.
Compassionate care.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Unconditional love.
Amazing. Ken, not to suggest we're not going back to this conversation, but it's really very noteworthy. You're a professional photographer by trade. I've seen your work. It's amazing. Tell us a bit about that. How do you fit that into everything you do?
Well, let me see. Going back to when I was a child, I was very quiet, very shy, didn't like to participate in conversations. And so I found photography was this great vehicle because I could participate with my surroundings without having to talk. And so, I was very engaged in life. I just didn't do it verbally. And so the camera was a great way for me to express my love of being alive and appreciation of colors and graphics and everything around us, society and people's faces. And so I think the camera was a great vehicle for me to come out of my shell slowly and, express this thing, of life, because I heard so much about death growing up. I wanted to go out and see life. And so my goal was to go out and photograph 101 countries, which I just succeeded in doing last month. I went down to Guatemala, and that was country number 101. Not that I'm going to stop, but, it's been a great ride getting to see over half the countries in the world and meeting tribal people and hanging out of helicopters and really living life fully, which is what Elizabeth tried to teach us. And so now that I'm running the foundation, it's interesting because photography with last recession kind of really went down into the dumps. Everything is free on the internet. But now I can go give speeches in South America and then take a few days off and do my photography. So it's this perfect combination of things where I go speak, I take some time off, I do some photographs, kind of recharges me. Then I give a speech in another country, I do some more photographs. And it's a great symbiotic relationship. So it's really worked out well. And, it's like my photography of life done to my mother's quotes about death. It's this kind of yin and yang with my mom and I.
That's great. And it truly is brilliant. We're going to have the link up to your gallery. And I certainly encourage people to see it, to visit it. Beautiful images.
Thank you.
Well, and photography, just as your mom was a writer and she worked with families, what you do with photography is also another way of
Memorializing
connecting with people. Yeah, and connecting with people around. Again, according to what you said earlier, your mom wasn't necessarily writing just about death; she was writing about life,
right,
and what that means. And I'm sure your photography also reflects that.
Yeah, I think it's a celebration of life. It's full of color and joy and so surrealistic, like I view life. And it's a great way to express that enthusiasm.
Yeah. Well, Ken, we're almost out of time, but with just a few minutes that we have left, if someone's listening to this episode and would like to connect with you or with your work, how might they go about doing that?
Well, they can come to our websites, of course. So the foundation website is www.ekrfoundation.org. And my own photography is at kenrossphotography.com. And then we're growing the foundation. We have groups in a dozen countries right now. So they can come to each of the different countries' websites in Brazil, in Argentina, Peru, Guatemala, Mexico, etc., and see what they're doing in a number of different languages. We have websites in Flemish, French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese right now.
Wow, that's great. Ken, again, we can't thank you enough for being a guest with us here on Let's Talk Death and for sharing the inspiration behind your photography, the work of your mother, the work that you're now doing to memorialize that work. We thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, friends. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great. And thank you for those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward, and the AMF app.
And if you are a bereaved adult, 18 or older, you can join the app where adults of all ages connect to others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure you sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links of future episodes to Let's Talk Death.
So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.